All righty, we move on to 2 Samuel. Again, an unknown author, but most historians credit Samuel or Nathan or Gad, who Gad was a prophet. And they credit maybe even all three of them having some input to the writing. Just to remind you, 1 Samuel emphasizes God's sovereignty over Israel. He is God's sovereign in 1 Samuel. So much so that when they rejected him, that's what God told Samuel. They've not rejected you, they've rejected me. They've rejected my sovereign leadership. And 2 Samuel emphasizes God's delegated kingship. And that delegated kingship comes through David and the house of David. It was most likely written between 931 and 792 BC, that 200-year period almost, 140. And so gives you an idea there. The main verse or the key verse is chapter 24, verse 24. We'll see this in a little while. We'll study chapter 24. But in verse 24, the king said to Araunah, this is David speaking to Araunah, who owned the threshing floor and the land. He said, "No, but I will surely buy it from you for a price. For I will not offer a burnt offering to the Lord my God, which cost me nothing." So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver. This was the idea that, and gives us the idea that when we offer something to the Lord, there has to be a price involved. There has to be a cost that we paid. There's a song that I used to sing years ago called "I Will Not Offer Anything That Costs Me Nothing." And it's the whole idea of surrender, the whole idea of sacrifice, the whole idea of giving up something in order to serve the Lord. 2 Samuel, remember we mentioned last time, was combined usually with 1 Samuel so that they made one book, but the Septuagint, now that's the Greek translation of the Old Testament, divided it into two. And this book, the book of 2 Samuel, has been called the book of David's reign. The book of David's reign. He reigns over the house of Israel for 40 years. It covers that 40-year reign over Israel. He became the king of Judah immediately following the death of Saul. He had that 40-year reign. He reigned for 7.5 years in Hebron, which was in the north, and then he reigned for 32.5 years in Jerusalem. So this is all about the reign of King David, his sovereign reign over Israel. The central message of the book is triumph turns to trouble because of sin. Snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, if you will. And we see how that happens, and we will see it unfold through the study. You can easily divide the book into two parts. We will. David's triumphs and David's trouble. So let's look at the triumphs first. The triumphs of David. Chapters 1 to 4 deal with David at Hebron. David at Hebron, Hebron, Hebron. This was a civil war period because Ishbosheth had taken and rebelled against David, and he had taken the tribes in the north to follow him. He said, I will be king over you. Just set me up as the king. And so this was a period of war between the house of David and the house of Saul. Ishbosheth was from the house of Saul. So you had these warring parties. And so chapters 1 to 4 are David at Hebron, the civil war. Chapters 5 to 11 show us David at Jerusalem. David at Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, which was originally called Jebus, Jebus, originally called Jebus. Um, that's First Chronicles 11 and verse 4. But this was David when David became king and was king at Jerusalem. This was David centralizing the worship of Israel in the city of Jerusalem. He was saying, not only are we going to unite the kingdom under my reign, but we're also going to unite the kingdom in worship of Almighty God in Jerusalem. And after the city was defeated and taken, it was called the city of David. I think we all remember that. Jerusalem, the city of David. In chapter 7, verses 8 through 16, we read of the Davidic covenant. The Davidic covenant. Other prophets would eventually affirm the covenant, but the Davidic covenant, and we're going to see 4 covenants in just a minute, but the Davidic covenant was all about God's faithfulness to his covenant. It was all about God being faithful, even though Israel was not faithful. It kind of reminds us, if you will, of 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 13. In 2 Timothy 2:13, Paul says, if we are faithless, he remains faithful because he cannot deny himself. God cannot deny who he is, and he cut the covenant with David, and he will not break that covenant. Now, God gave 4 covenants particularly, and I want us to see those. The first is the Adamic covenant, the covenant with Adam. This is the promise that was given to Adam, and it was the promise of a race of people who would belong to God. He is entering into a covenant with Adam at the very beginning to make the human race his people. Then there was a promise given to Abraham, and this was the promise to a nation. It was to the nation that he was going to be faithful. He entered into the covenant with Abraham, saying, I'm going to make a great nation of you, and I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And this was for the nation that would come from Abraham. And then there was a promise given to Jacob. Jacob, whose name was changed to, anybody remember? Jacob's name was changed to Israel. But this was a covenant promise to a tribe of people, the tribe of Judah, the tribe that God said, this is the tribe that is going to produce the Messiah. And then you have this promise given to David, and it is the promise of a family, that from David's line, from David's family would come the Messiah. So you see, the covenants that God made started out with a race, then it got a little smaller to a nation, and from the nation to a tribe, and from the tribe to a family. But this is God's covenant. This is the way God enters into covenant with his people. And so the Davidic covenant confirms God's faithfulness to his covenant and to his people. In chapter 9, we see David's unusual kindness. His unusual kindness. In chapter 9, we read the account of Mephibosheth. Fun to say, but sometimes hard to spell. Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth was the son of Jonathan. Jonathan was the son of who? Saul, right. And David and Jonathan were best friends. I mean, they were so close to one another. And this is long after Saul has died, Jonathan has died. Most of Saul's family is gone. And David says, is there anyone left of the family of Saul to whom I can show kindness? And the reason he wanted to show that kindness wasn't because of Saul. I mean, Saul had been a bitter enemy, right? He'd wanted to kill him. But he wanted to show this kindness to anyone who was of Saul's family for the sake of Jonathan, because of his friendship with Jonathan. His love for another drove him to care for Mephibosheth. Now, does anybody remember the main feature of Mephibosheth? He was a cripple. He was crippled in both feet. He couldn't flee. He couldn't run. He couldn't get out of the way. Everybody ignored him. Everybody had nothing to do with him. But the word came to David, there is one left of Jonathan, his son Mephibosheth. And David said, call him, bring him here. And he brought him in, and he said, you will eat at my table from now on. You'll never be a stranger at my table. Now, this is a great reminder to us of our redemption by God, because God has shown mercy and grace to us because of his love for another. Because of his love for Jesus, he extends grace to us, and he offers that life to us that the world ignored when the world ignores us. And God shows us that love for the sake of another. What a great story. I encourage you to go back and read chapter 9 once again and just capture that whole redemption story. Chapter 10, we see David's highest success. His highest success. This is when he goes and fights the Arameans and he destroys them. Great victory, great triumph as he defeats the Arameans. So, from chapter 1 to chapter 10, we read of David's triumphs. But that all changes when we get to chapter 11, right? Chapter 11 tells us of David's greatest sin. His greatest sin. He saw Bathsheba. It's interesting, in chapter 11 you read, at the time of year when all the kings went out to war. Now, evidently, kings in that era had a specific time of year they'd go out and go to war. They thought it was favorable to go out at that time. But it says when all the kings went out to war, David stayed home. David's king. He ought to be leading his people Israel into battle, but he stayed home. And when he stayed home, we know what happened. He saw Bathsheba. He took her as his own. She becomes pregnant. Now he's got real trouble. The adultery led to lying. The lying led to plotting evil. The plotting of evil led to murder. And the murder led to cover up. So this is, from this point on, from chapter 11 on, David's life is just one calamity after another. One trouble after another, all because of sin. Chapter 12, we see David's confession. His confession, you'll remember, the prophet Nathan comes to him and confronts him. Tells him the story about the man who owned this wonderful little ewe lamb that was precious to him. And someone came and stole it and, left the man with nothing. David said the man ought to die. And Nathan said those famous words, you are the man. You're the man. And so this is David's confession. He finally, after Nathan confronts him, he confesses his sin and pleads for the Lord's forgiveness. You'll remember that the child that was born to Bathsheba died. Even though, while the child lay sick, David bowed before the Lord and pleaded and pleaded and pleaded for the child to be spared. And all of his leaders are standing beside him, and the child dies. And David hears them whispering, and he says, the child died, didn't he? And they said, yes. And he got up and he washed himself, he changed his clothes, and he went and worshiped the Lord. Now, they thought that was bizarre. They thought it was really strange. And they said, "What's going on here?" And David said, "I thought that while he was alive, maybe God would spare him. But one way or the other, I still worship the Lord." And so he was worshiping God even through that sorrow. Chapter 11 is greatest sin. Chapter 12 is greatest confession. Chapter 12 also, his chosen heir is Solomon. He had other sons, Absalom, Adonijah, but Solomon is his chosen heir. And we read in chapter 12 also of his last victory where he conquers the royal city of Ammon. Chapter 18, we read of his grief over Absalom, Absalom, Absalom. Absalom was his son, and Absalom was a favored son to David. If I remember correctly, David didn't rebuke him, he didn't correct him over anything, but yet he loved him. And Joab, who was the leader of the army, mercilessly killed Absalom. You might remember it was Absalom who had the long hair, and he got caught in the tree while he was fleeing from Joab, and he's just hanging there by his hair, and Joab just drives him through with spears. But Absalom even followed into his father's sinful footsteps. He wasn't a righteous man at all, but still he was killed mercilessly by Joab, and David grieved over the death of Absalom. So much so that when the army came back and they had won a victory against the Ammonites, he didn't say anything about the victory. And Joab had to come to him and said, "Look, you're the king. You go out there and tell them they did a good job, basically. Tell them they won a great victory." And so he did, even over his grief over Absalom. Chapter 22, we read David's song of praise for deliverance. His song of praise for deliverance, how God had delivered them and brought them through and given them victory. It's interesting to note that there are bookend songs, if you will, in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. In 1 Samuel 2, we read the song of Hannah. You'll remember Hannah was Samuel's mother. She had been barren, and she went, and then God gave her a son. She gave the son back to God to serve as a priest and as a prophet, and she sang a song to God, a song of favor, a song of blessing, as her son would be one who would deliver Israel through his judgments. And then in 2 Samuel chapter 22, we read the song of David's praise for God's deliverance. So you've got 1 Samuel 2, a song of God going to deliver his people. And in Psalm 22, or 2 Samuel 22, we've got the song of God bringing deliverance for his people. And the songs, I think, emphasize God's rulership. They emphasize his sovereign control and his deliverance of his people. In chapter 23, even, we go a little bit further and we see David's final song. It's a song of praise in which he is called the sweet psalmist of Israel. This is David worshiping the Lord. And in chapter 24, we find his final act of rebellion. His final act of rebellion. In chapter 24, you can also read it in 1 Chronicles 21. David decided he wanted to count the number of men in his army. But God told him not to count the men in the army. But David counted them anyway. It's God permitted Satan to tempt David, much like he did Job in the book of Job. He allowed Satan to tempt him, but neither Satan nor God caused David to sin. His pride caused him to sin, and when he was tempted, he chose sin. It's kind of like us. I mean, it's not Satan that causes us to sin. It's not God who pushes us into sin. James says God cannot be tempted, and he doesn't tempt any man. But we choose sin, oftentimes just because of pride, or oftentimes just that's what we want to do at the time. I think it was R.C. Sproul who said, the reason we sin is because at that particular moment we love sin more than we love God. So this is where we are. David's rebellion. He counts the army. But in verse 10, let's look there, chapter 24 and verse 10. In verse 10, God comes along and he says, look, you've disobeyed me. So in verse 10, David's heart was troubled because he numbered the people. And so David said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I've done. Now, Lord, please take away the iniquity of your servant. I have acted foolishly. This is David with a contrite heart. This is David with a broken heart. This is David pouring out his heart to the Lord to seek his forgiveness. He was sensitive to the Spirit of God. He was convicted of his sin, and he calls out to the Lord for forgiveness. Then God sends Gad, the prophet, and he says to him, go and speak to David. Thus says the Lord, I am offering you 3 things. Now imagine that. You sin against God, and he says, I'm going to give you your choice of 3 punishments. And here are the 3 punishments. I'll give you 3 things. Choose for yourself one of them, and I'll do it to you. So Gad came to David. Shall 7 years famine come to your land? Or shall there be 3 days pestilence in your land? Or, I'm sorry, I skipped one. Or you will flee 3 months from your foes while they pursue you. So you've got 7 years of famine, 3 months of being chased by your foes, or 3 days of pestilence from the hand of God. What would you choose? You know, you're the leader of Israel, you're the king of Israel. What are you going to choose? But David chose the 3 days, the 3 days of pestilence. Because the pestilence came from the Lord, and he thought there would be more mercy with the Lord than from his foes. And so he chose 3 days of pestilence. And because of his disobedience, 70,000 men died. Disobedience is costly. And beginning in verse 18, we come to the end. Gad comes to David and he says, you need to go up and erect an altar and threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite. Araunah was a man who was a landowner. He had a threshing floor that was very useful. And so he went up to Araunah, and Gad told him, he said, you need to go and offer a sacrifice on the altar to God at the threshing floor of Araunah. And so he goes to Araunah and he says, I'll buy the threshing floor. Araunah says, look, you're the king. I'm not. He said, you can have the threshing floor. I'll even give you the wood for the sacrifice of fire. I'll even give you the sacrifice. I'll give you whatever you need. And David said, no, I will not offer to the Lord an offering that costs me nothing. And so he bought the threshing floor at Araunah. It's interesting, the threshing floor of Araunah was also known as Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah. Do you remember what else Mount Moriah was known for? 2 things. Mount Moriah was the mountain that Abraham and Isaac climbed. Abraham was going to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. Mount Moriah was also the mount on which the temple was built. The temple before the Lord. So even though David is known as a man after God's own heart, we see that he too needs salvation. He needed redemption. He needed forgiveness. And this book shows us that God is faithful to his covenant promises, providing a way for and pointing to the coming of Jesus, who is the one true king who would never disappoint. All of the kings of Israel disappointed, didn't they? Saul, certainly. David, yes. Solomon, yes. All of them. We recently went through that in Matthew chapter 1, that all of them failed. But yet God is true and faithful to the promise, and his covenant promise is there is a king who is coming who will never disappoint, and his name is Jesus. So, Second Chronicles, great stories, great illustrations of the mercy of God, great illustrations of the compassion of David for Mephibosheth, but also the failure of David. And I want us to make sure we don't think, well, David's called a man after God's own heart. He went through all this. God loved him anyway, so maybe he'll overlook my sin. No. Don't forget, David came at a high price before the Lord. A broken spirit, a contrite heart. Read Psalm 51 as David pours out his heart after his affair with Bathsheba. But he pours out his heart. It cost him the life of his son, 2 of them. It cost the life of 70,000 men. It cost him a great sacrifice on Mount Moriah at the threshing floor of Araunah. Sin is costly, and we take sin seriously, as we should.